Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Cedarville Stories Podcast. I'm Mark Weinstein. Today's program will be unique as I will be talking with Dan Jacobsen, leadership and teaching pastor at Heartland Community Church in Olathe, Kansas. Now, talking with a pastor isn't unique, but his story of coming alongside his grandfather to write a devotional book that's been in the making for at least 10 years brings some intrigue to the story. And I should add, Dan's grandfather was the late Warren Wiersbe, a dear friend of Cedarville University, and his personal library is available for students today at Cedarville. So let's go to my conversation with Pastor Dan Jacobsen on today's Cedarville Stories Podcast. So welcome to the program, Dan. I am sure that being the grandson of Warren and Betty Wiersbe had to influence you to a degree to pursue a pastoral studies and counseling degree at Moody Bible Institute. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, it's a funny story. You know, you're just jumping right into my connection to my grandfather. I actually studied at the Moody Bible Institute, Moody being a very easy association with my grandfather. He pastored the church throughout the 1970s.
Right.
And I actually, believe it or not, I left his name off of my application to Moody, partly because my grandfather's so well known. I was afraid that I would absolutely get in if I told people that I was related to him.
Right.
But I also was trying to discern a calling from God, whether or not he had put a calling to preach on my own life, or if I was just trying to jump into the family business. You know what I mean by that? Like just trying to run the legacy of my grandfather. So I actually went to Moody. And they accepted me based upon just my own heart, my own calling. And from there, have just really learned to grow and love the connection my grandfather, my grandmother had in terms of my time and my ministry. They prayed so hard for me, for my family, for all of my cousins, just great prayer warriors, and cared deeply that we would love God and be in the ministry. So yeah, it's fair to say they had a deep influence in my life.
So you mentioned about the legacy of pastors. How many pastors are in the Wiersbe clan, the Wiersbe legacy?
You know, Mark, that's a great question. I know it goes all the way back, our family pastoral lineage. It's unbroken back to the 1870s. Sweden, there's a man named Johan Alfred Carlson. My grandfather used to tell a story all the time about how he was a prayer warrior and he prayed that there'd be a preacher in every generation of our family. And to the best of my understanding, my grandfather, Warren Wiersbe, was the third answer to that prayer. My uncle Dave was the fourth answer to that prayer. I am the fifth answer to that prayer. And then just recently, I've got a cousin who has jumped into ministry, and he's pastoring in Lowell, Indiana, Northwest Indiana.
Yeah.
And Ryan Smith, great dude. Love Ryan. If you're listening, Ryan, hi. But he's another part of that lineage as well. So Warren would be his great uncle. So yeah, so many of us God has called us to give him our lives and to preach and to make much of Jesus.
Yes. Yeah. How long have you been a pastor?
I've been a pastor now, believe it or not, 17 years. I started when I was 20. When Warren Wiersbe is your grandpa, it's hard not to compare your ministries to his.
Right.
My grandfather was 19 when he started pastoring, senior pastor at E Chicago, Indiana. And I started as a youth pastor at a really great church right outside Chicago. When I was 21 years old. And so from then I've just been doing my best to preach and to love people and to keep my heart focused on God's word. And the power of the Spirit has been just rich through the ministry. And I share a lot of the same passion that my grandfather shared, which is to help real people understand the word of God so that they can be changed into the heart of God, like the image of Jesus. And so it's really been a lot of what my ministry has been, a lot of teaching, a lot of leadership in that direction.
So in your formative years, Dan, growing up, the grandson of a really famous preacher and theologian and author, were you able to spend a lot of time with the Wiersbe grandparents? And what was your grandfather like? Yeah.
Yes is the answer. You know, we lived in Chicago, and my grandfather was the general director of Back to the Bible, which is a radio ministry. It's still going on today.
Right.
It's based out of Lincoln, Nebraska. So in the 80s, he moved out to Lincoln, Nebraska. So we were always separated from one end of I-80 to the other end of I-80, which is not true, but it felt like it, out in Lincoln to Chicago. And my grandfather kept such a huge itinerant travel, and I literally grew up about a mile from O'Hare Airport.
Really?
And so whenever my grandfather would be back in Chicago or back in the area, which he was often back in the area visiting many schools and very different, many churches, he would fly in and we would go pick him up and bring him to our house, and he'd stay and kind of home base with us. In fact, Mark, it's a funny story. He told it in one of his books, but when I was about 2 years old, I actually thought O'Hare Airport was my grandfather's house. We would drive past it and I'd say, "Hey, there's Grandpa's house." That's how frequently we were picking him up. We definitely spent a lot of time together. And he influenced a lot of, I think, just the ways a grandfather is involved in a grandkid's life. He was so intentional. Being farther away, making the most of our time together was really great. We just discovered, my uncle and I just found a letter he wrote to one of his friends in 1993. I was playing t-ball at the time, and my grandpa was declining a speaking invitation, but he ended the letter about how much fun he had watching me play t-ball that week. And so there's a lot of those normal experiences that really just a grandfather and a grandson could have together.
Boy, that has to be a great, cherished memory for you to know that even back when you were playing t-ball, your grandfather was loving on you, and you didn't even know it.
Didn't even know it. Yeah. It was definitely a strange experience to wake up in the morning and go to the kitchen, and my mom would have 90.1, which is WMBI in Chicago, Moody radio. Right. And without fail, I would hear the voice of my grandfather coming across the boom box back then in the kitchen. And I don't know. I was just so naive. I thought everybody's grandpa was on the radio. So it just was what it was. And we didn't think of him as a celebrity or anything like that. He was really into his work. He was really always asking us as little kids, "What are you writing these days?" Which is a funny joke if you're a pastor asking a little kid, "What are you writing?" But he was always willing to take some time and to hang out with us and to chat with us. Yeah.
Now he wasn't thinking of himself as a celebrity either. He was a quite humble man, but he had a great, I'll say, sense of humor. He was lively, and here's where I want to go. I know in our library here at Cedarville, there are at least 2 books, maybe 3, of his sleight of hand tricks. Tell us, he had to do some of these sleight of hand tricks for you guys. Tell us some stories about that.
Oh my goodness. It was, we kind of look at him now as like dad jokes, I guess, but he would make the coins disappear, and he'd play, pull cards out and do card shuffling deck, magic tricks, I guess, sleight of hand things. Those books were the first books. There's, I believe, 3 books that were all printed by a magic company in Chicago. He went down and I think sold the manuscript for all of these magic books for like $10 back in the 30s, I think, or 40s. He was 16 years old. The first 3 books he ever wrote were magic tricks, which for a Baptist living at that point was kind of controversial, right?
I would think so, yeah.
It absolutely was. Actually, a great friend of ours, Peter Schrader, is a pastor of a church in Lincoln, Nebraska. He worked at Back to the Bible, and the parking lot of his church, on the other side of it, is a magic store. And my grandfather used to go worship at the church, and then in his 80s, he'd walk across the parking lot and go check out all of their magician tricks and things like that. He was always captivated by what it was to hold someone's sense of wonder and to hold their attention. He grew up listening to the golden era of radio, and so comedians on the radio were really important to him. He credited a lot of his natural sense of timing. Like, he was a very funny person, very funny. He was always telling jokes. And I don't know anyone in the world who could get my mom to laugh so hard as my grandpa. Really? He would come over and he would tell her a joke, and she knew there was a punchline coming, but she couldn't ever figure it out. And then he'd get there and she'd either groan and just tell him how terrible a joke it was, or she'd bust a gut. It was pretty great. My grandma, bless her heart, Betty, maybe the greatest thing she ever did, this is hyperbole, but in my mind, the greatest thing she ever did was laugh at all of my grandpa's jokes. She heard them thousands of times, but they always hit her funny in a new way. And the two of them were just really special together.
Did that humor and the sleight of hand tricks last to his final days, or what did you see there?
Yeah, my grandpa was always trying to break through people's exteriors with humor. He was a big fan of Spurgeon. He was a student of Spurgeon. And Spurgeon, in his writings, he would edit out all of his humor. And I remember my grandfather saying he thought that was a mistake, not to criticize Spurgeon, but my grandfather thought, humor is a tool, use it sparingly in the pulpit, but it's an easy way to help crack the door into someone's heart because you can relate with them and you can connect with them. Right. In the latter part of his years, I would fly into Lincoln and we'd visit my grandma who was in a hospital. And I remember driving to the hospital, getting out and walking into the hospital with my grandfather. Here's a man who pastored in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and he did thousands of hospital visits. A hospital was almost the same as a sanctuary for him. He'd go talk to everybody. And more often than not, he'd find a really funny way to start up a conversation with people. And I thought that was just a really special gift that he had. And I think something that really God used to help him build a lot of friendships.
Yeah, I think you're right. So as you know, Dan, your grandfather's library, the books that he used to study, the books that he has written, is housed at Cedarville University. It's where students, faculty, anyone on campus can benefit from it. And it's a cherished treasure we have for sure. To me, that speaks to the mutual admiration that he had for us, Cedarville University, and we had for him. Can you speak to that connection of how the two really mesh together?
Yeah. So Mark, it's funny for me because the first time my grandfather ever spoke at Cedarville, I think President Dixon, so Paul Dixon, invited him to Cedarville in 1987, if I remember correctly. And I was like a toddler. I had no clue that he was, building this connection to Cedarville and whatnot. And then he came back. It seemed like year after year after year to the chapels and different avenues. He turned down so many invitations elsewhere, and he always said yes to Cedarville. I think there was a really special connection between Paul Dixon and my grandfather. Okay. They had that like Tennessee temple thing kind of like in their background. Right. And I just think there's a huge mutual admiration. My grandfather almost talked me into attending Cedarville. If Cedarville was in Chicago, I would have been there in a heartbeat. But he was very fond of the school and said, Dan, if Moody isn't for you, then I think you should really think about Cedarville. And my grandfather, was definitely one who cared deeply about how institutions, especially Christian institutions, go about the business of training pastors. He used to call seminaries. I know there's all these jokes about seminaries, and my grandfather definitely fell into the tropes of making fun of seminaries. But I remember he would say, the seminary is like poison. You need to handle it the same way you handle poison, because not every seminary is going to help your heart. In fact, a lot of seminaries are going to build your head and kill your heart. And he never felt that way about Cedarville. He always thought that the education in the scriptures were done in such a way in which the student body seemed to love the word of God. Yeah. And I think that really was what he was all about. And I think he just really appreciated that there was this beautiful evangelical institution in the middle of Ohio that was doing God's work, helping build the church for generations to come. Yeah. And so I think when it came time, Nancy Voorhees is a longtime friend of ours. She's a former faculty member at Cedarville. Sure. When I think she was the one who had the idea to see if my grandfather would give all of his resources and his books, and there's something like 11,000 books in his library at one point. I don't know how many are on display in the reading room, but there's just a lot going on. When my grandfather said yes to that, I think it really resonated in his heart as the right thing to do, because of how many students could get access to the stuff that really shaped him. Sure. I wish I lived closer to you guys. I'm in the middle of Kansas City. I would be in that library every day if I was a pastor within 30 miles of Cedarville, because what people don't really know about a secondhand library, especially from Warren Wiersbe, is that my grandfather was AI before AI was even conceived.
Wow.
He had this is true. He had a photographic memory, and there's only two people in the world that I think had a photographic memory like his. One is Al Mohler, and the other was him. Wow. My grandpa could tell you what book, what volume, what chapter, what page a quote was on. Really? And he was a brilliant resource. And so he would underline things. He would index all of his books at the back. So pull any of those books off the shelf at the library and look in the back, and you can see what it was that he cared about. And so all the books that I received from my grandfather, I called them pre-read. Like I already had the cheater code for what was important from this work, because he had already taken the time to understand the thought, to highlight the relevant passages. And then he would sometimes synthesize the author's argument. And sometimes he would critique it right there in the book. There's a set of commentaries. I won't name them, but they didn't go to Cedarville. I have them. And he didn't want them to go to Cedarville because they were, in his mind, well, they came to me in a box, and on the outside of the box was the phrase "the bad ones." Oh. If that tells you anything, these were commentaries that he was like, no, this is wrong theology. This is almost heretical. My grandfather read everybody. He wanted to understand, but sure. I can go through that commentary series and see where he picks apart arguments, and it's just a treasure. My grandfather's mind and heart is contained in the pages of those books. So it's more than just like, here's a bunch of books that some guy had. It's truly like a living library, and I hope it blesses generations of students to come. It's
a living legacy for sure. And I'm going to go over to the Wiersbe Reading and Library and check out. I'm gonna open up some books just to see some of his markings. Now that you mentioned that, that sounds really fascinating to me.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So let's transition to another book, and that's the devotional book, Becoming New, which will be released on November 5th, 2024 by David C. Cook Publishing. This is a devotional book that was started by your grandfather and completed by you. Can you share the story of how you discovered the manuscript for Becoming New? That's fascinating.
Yeah. So this is a book that my grandfather was writing. He started writing it, we believe, in 2012.
Okay.
He would have been right around like 81, 82 years old at that point. And what he was trying to do was distill down his decades of deep Bible study, this deep knowledge he had of God's word, and all the links that would happen between the Old Testament, the New Testament, and all the different stories. And he never really finished it. It was such a big task, but he got it like 80% done. And when he passed in May of 2019. And my uncle was going through all of his files, and there's just thousands of files and things that were left over. And he found this manila file folder, if you can believe it, kind of just in the corner off to the side. And it was one of many file folders. And he kind of picked it up and dusted it off. It was truly like the dusty hidden gem. And he opened it up, and he was like, wow, there's something here. He had given it a name. He had given it a purpose. He had sketched out that it would be 100 days of what it's like for God to change someone. Like, how does God actually go about changing us? He took the concept of metamorphosis and sketched it out through the scriptures. And it was about 80% done. And so through some thinking and praying and trying different avenues to see what we could do with this work, it eventually came to me. My uncle said, Dan, he was like, I don't really want to do this project, but I think maybe you do. And I was like, are you kidding me? I would love to dig into what my grandpa had written. And Mark, between you and me, I really did not think that this was going to see a publisher. I didn't think it was going to see the light of day. I just knew that my grandfather's his devotional books had a profound impact on me. And the mercy of it was that every day was only like 600 words. So it was like a really short daily commitment to going through it. Yeah. I was like, man, I can go through this, man, in a couple of months, I'll be done with it. And so I picked it up and I started to look at it. And I realized why it was stuck in a manila file folder. It was kind of a mess. It was a little bit of like the best of my grandfather's writings. Like 80 years, he had cherry picked the absolute cream of the crop, any of his best illustrations, best quotes, best ideas, and he was trying to synthesize them all together. But then there were some things that I was like, man, this is the diary of a madman. And it's just because it was a draft. It wasn't like in any shape to be published. And so I sat on it. I got it in 2020. You know, the world is going crazy with COVID. And I've got this manila file folder on my desk. That's my grandpa's. And I looked at it and I was like, man, I am terrified about this project. And it took me about 9 to 10 months before I could actually work up the courage to, in my word processing, you know, in Microsoft Word, to actually like make a change. Like change any of his words, delete any lines, like supplement what was missing. And so, I mean, I'll tell you one quick story of what God used in this project in my heart. I was stuck in this passage on Moses, and I remember thinking like, I need to be able to like figure out what would Warren Wiersbe say about what Moses is going through in this moment. And I remember like I was sitting in this chair, sitting at this desk. I remember leaning back and put my hands behind my head, kind of looking up and being like, God, I don't know what my grandpa would say. And the phrase came to me, it said, faith that can't be tested can't be trusted. Doesn't that sound like my grandpa? Right. I mean, that sounds like Warren Wiersbe. Yeah. So I was like, that's really good. So I wrote it down. I was like, oh yeah, that's what my grandpa would say. Faith that can't be tested, can't be trusted. And I kept moving on. I was like, I'm starting to pick up some steam. Like this is coming more naturally. Thank you. You know, I don't believe in channeling divine spirits or anything like that. But I was like, I feel like that was an answer to prayer. And then it occurred to me, like, if my grandpa's name's going to be on this book, I probably shouldn't plagiarize. So I Googled it. And sure enough, it got attributed to somebody else. I was like, I knew I had heard that phrase somewhere.
Oh, wow.
So I deleted it. I was like, I can't put that in my grandpa's book. And I kept going on. And for some reason, I couldn't leave it. And I thought, you know what? That quote was from like a guy who said that in 2010. I wonder if I could find. And so I Googled it again. And wouldn't you believe that it was published in a Warren Wiersbe book in 1974? I was like, I can't plagiarize the guy who's writing the book. You know what I mean? Like, this is amazing. And I just, from that moment on, I had this tremendous sense of confidence that like, okay, I'm up to this task. I would love to represent my grandfather's voice and his heart. It was about 80% done. So it wasn't really like a hard task, but through the writing of this book, I really grew to understand my grandpa's heart for Jesus. And in understanding his heart, I understood Jesus's heart for me even more too. So it was such a special project for me to work on. And the fact that the publisher has been so excited about it and the reception to it has been off the charts, just abnormally, you know, Mark, I've never written anything. I've never published anything. And here we are doing a book that's just really incredible. And the pre-sales are going amazing. And I just feel like God is in the midst of it and he's been guiding it the whole way, regardless of me, regardless of my grandpa, just taking some trusted teaching and helping us understand transformation.
So how long did it take you once you started to complete the process?
Yeah, well, I've been pastoring full time and I've got little kids and we moved to Kansas City in the midst of it all. It took me about 2 years of really taking moments to consider, mull, think. And it took me 2 years. And I think some of our family would have wished it would have taken me 2 weeks.
Sure.
But, these things take time. And so I all in all, I've sat on this project now for about 3.5 years. And this is the closest thing I think to like, birthing a child, bringing this thing out into the world and letting people enjoy it that I've ever, the gestational period of this project has been so long. And I can't wait for November 5th. I don't know what you're doing on November 5th. I hear there's something going on in America on November 5th. I don't know like what's going on the first Tuesday of November in, an election year, but I'm going to be going to my local Barnes and Noble and just taking pictures of my grandpa's book because it's just so crazy to me that it's actually out there.
There may be nothing more important than getting Warren Wiersbe's devotional book on election day than election day. Although I will say we do need to vote. So as believers, that's our responsibility. So do you feel confident that you were able to maintain Warren Wiersbe's voice throughout the book?
Yeah, that's the thing that I feel most humbled by. I grew up, so close to my grandfather. And so, not in awe of him, but like I respected him. I very much appreciated his faith, and to know his heart for me, to know his heart for our family. Like, he prayed so much for us to know Jesus, all the way to the end. And so there's a part of me that's like, I want to honor his voice. I want to make sure that that was my biggest fear, was that I would just like insert something kind of clumsy that wouldn't represent who he was or how he would say things. And the greatest compliment the publisher gave me was vintage Wiersbe. I was like, good, I'm glad, because man, I would have really been like, this is like an AI copy of Wiersbe. That would have been weird, Yeah. You can always tell like the actual soul of someone compared to like the replica soul of someone. And because he had finished so much of this project, there's really minimal seams that I think you'll find in reading this work. I think you'll hear his voice kind of pop off of every page.
Thanks for joining me this week on the Cedarville Stories Podcast. I had a great conversation with Dan Jacobsen. I hope you enjoyed it as well. Join me next week when we finish this conversation with Dan Jacobsen on the Cedarville Stories Podcast.